From the heart of Africa, Burkina Faso shines anew.
The Africa Spoke. Don't forget to subscribe for more powerful African stories.
They didn't take our oil. They didn't take our gold. They took our water. Not by war, not with tanks, but with lawyers, backroom deals, and billion-dollar smiles. Every single day, 4 million cubic meters, enough to hydrate entire cities, vanished beneath our soil, pumped into pipelines guarded by men with no flags. Not a drop spilled, not a headline printed, not a single camera rolling. You want to talk about theft? This wasn't colonialism in the past tense. It's happening right now, sanitized, legitimized, and exported. And the world, silent. So we asked, can a country still call itself free if its water is no longer its own? Because here's the real question. If this had happened in California, would it be a resource contract? Or would it be called what it is, eco-plunder wrapped in paperwork? If you feel a knot in your gut reading this, hit like. If you think the US would never allow this on American soil, comment below, not in our backyard. And if you're still watching, keep going. Because what one leader did next might just change everything. A $600 million contract signed in another country, affecting millions of people who never knew it existed. Let's break this down. In late 2022, a foreign-owned mining conglomerate, registered in Australia, backed by European capital, finalized a long-term water extraction deal with the government of Burkina Faso's northern neighbor. The contract gave them access to one of the largest underground reservoirs in West Africa, a natural aquifer that stretched across both countries' borders and supplied water to at least 4 provinces in Burkina Faso. But here's the part no one talks about. The deal was signed without any input from Burkina Faso's parliament. There was no press release, no local hearing, no cross-border consultation. In fact, the people living above the reservoir, farmers, herders, families, had no idea they were about to lose the most critical resource they had. And while officials on both sides of the border insisted it was just standard commercial development, the evidence said otherwise. Satellite images from early 2023 showed at least 17 separate pipeline construction zones, all leading away from Burkina Faso territory. Security outposts being built around pumping stations. Military-style convoys transporting equipment through unmarked roads. And in one particularly damning frame, a group of engineers installing underground purifiers, not to clean water for locals, but to prep it for export. None of this was disclosed. None of this was debated. It was, in every sense, a deal made behind closed doors, with full knowledge of what it would cost. And it gets worse, because what looked like infrastructure was actually occupation. Construction began less than a month after the contract was signed. The company didn't use local contractors. Most of the work was carried out by external teams flown in from the United Arab Emirates and Malaysia. Locals reported seeing convoys move at night, escorted by men in unmarked uniforms, speaking languages no one recognized. Within 90 days, more than 40 kilometers of pipeline had been laid. Not 1 meter was announced publicly. By the time the first whistleblower raised alarm inside the Burkina Faso Ministry of Environment, the system was already pumping water, not into communities but into sealed tanks bound for industrial mining operations across the border. Water levels in nearby villages started dropping. Wells that once supplied entire districts began to run dry. Farmers noticed their crops withering sooner. Livestock deaths increased. People blamed drought, until someone asked why the pumps across the border were still running. The answer came quietly. A leaked document from a senior official confirmed the government had been aware of the operation from the beginning. Worse, several key members of the cabinet had signed non-disclosure agreements tied to foreign compensation packages. And this wasn't just about neglect. This was calculated compliance. Some of the extracted water was used for lithium processing. Lithium, the same mineral powering electric vehicles and smartphones. The irony was hard to ignore. While Western governments campaigned for green energy, The water required to produce it was being pulled from communities with no electricity and no running taps. What would happen if the American Midwest lost access to the Ogallala Aquifer because a foreign corporation decided lithium was more important than farming? Would anyone call that development, or would they call it theft? If you believe this isn't just a local issue, but a global pattern, hit like. And tell us below, should water be treated as a human right or a commodity? Because what happened next didn't come from a boardroom. It came from the war room. The first signs of militarization came when drone footage revealed heat signatures at 5 key pumping stations. All of them showed identical guard formations, clusters of between 15 to 25 men, armed, stationary, positioned at corners and gate points. Standard perimeter defense layout. They weren't local forces. Their gear was too advanced. Western-manufactured rifles, encrypted communications, thermal surveillance towers, flown in through unofficial border crossings, using routes previously used by mining companies to avoid customs inspections. One internal intelligence report estimated the total security force at over 800 men, not regular soldiers, not even contractors registered with official agencies. These were mercenaries, hired through third-party logistics networks, operating under private military licenses in jurisdictions where enforcement is weak by design. No national flags, no clear employer, no chain of accountability. All sites were surrounded by digital jamming fields. Satellite coverage was blocked in a 2-kilometer radius. Civilians were denied access. In some regions, journalists attempting to approach were detained or turned away at roadblocks set up by private security. And here's what raised the red flag inside Burkina Faso's defense ministry. The reservoir itself wasn't just shared territory. It was protected under the 1997 Regional Water Sovereignty Agreement, signed by 7 Sahel nations, including the very neighbor who greenlit this operation. This wasn't just environmental overreach, it was a treaty violation, a breach of sovereignty. What would happen if foreign troops, unmarked, privately paid, appeared around the Great Lakes in the U.S., extracting groundwater without public record, protected by export contracts no state governor ever approved? Would that be tolerated as economic development? Or would it trigger a federal crisis? If you think this situation would have made front-page headlines in America, but somehow stayed hidden here, ask yourself why. Ask who benefits from silence. Because when President Traoré finally stepped into the war room, it wasn't just to review maps, it was to draw a line. The first meeting inside the presidential war room wasn't about soldiers. It was about water flow. President Traoré sat with his intelligence chief, defense minister, and 3 engineers who had been tracking water loss across the region. No PowerPoint, no briefings, just a satellite map, printed in black and red. The numbers were worse than expected. Roughly 4 million cubic meters of water were being pulled across the border every month. That's enough to supply drinking water to every household in the country and still irrigate 200,000 hectares of farmland. Gone. Every 30 days. None of it taxed, none of it declared. And the part that broke the room? The engineers had discovered the water wasn't just being extracted, it was being treated on-site. Underground purification systems had been built to prepare the water for export-quality use, meaning it was never coming back. One of the younger officers said it plainly. They're not just taking our water, they've built the infrastructure to erase it. Traoré stood, quiet for a moment, then asked one question. How fast can we reverse this? No one had an answer. Because here's the truth. You can't just unplug a foreign operation protected by international contracts, reinforced by private armies, and hidden behind legal silence. It's not that simple. Every move would have consequences, diplomatic, economic, even military. The Foreign Affairs Minister laid it out straight. If we act unilaterally, they'll call it a violation. We're risking sanctions, trade blocks, isolation. Traoré didn't blink. He walked to the end of the table, picked up a pen, and scribbled a number onto a notepad. Then he passed it back. 300 million. That's what he was about to spend, not on weapons, not on lawsuits, but on digging. There was no press conference, no national address, no leak to the media. Just a signed directive, handwritten, stamped, and delivered to the head of the National Reconstruction Fund. Release 300 million, effective immediately. full authorization for domestic water reclamation. The money didn't come from loans. It didn't come from donors. This wasn't IMF money. It came from a sovereign reserve built quietly over the last 4 years, funds that had been held for crisis recovery, emergency food programs, and post-debt stabilization. Now, it would be used to dig. The operation had a name: Green Lifeline. The objective was simple on paper, nearly impossible in practice: build enough internal water infrastructure to make Burkina Faso independent of the reservoir under dispute, and do it in 18 months. The rollout started the same week. Trucks carrying drilling rigs moved into the eastern provinces. Solar-powered purification units were deployed to former military outposts. Over 1,200 engineers, contractors, hydrologists, and technicians, many of them under 35, were placed into 23 target zones. Some worked with maps printed on old paper. Others relied on open-source satellite data because official topography was years out of date. It didn't matter. The order was clear: drill, connect, stabilize. Old colonial piping systems were decommissioned. Temporary desalination units were flown in. In dry zones near the northern border, mobile units were escorted by community militias who had never guarded anything but their own homes. Within 30 days, over 60 new wells had been dug. 12 of them were active. 4 were clean enough for direct use. It wasn't enough, but it was more than what the country had the month before. And for the first time in nearly 2 decades, a national moratorium was issued. All foreign-led water operations were suspended pending review. The infrastructure was only half the battle. Digging wells and building reservoirs could provide temporary relief, but it couldn't protect anything. What the president needed now was leverage. 3 weeks after the Green Lifeline campaign began, a draft law landed on his desk. It had been written quietly by a group of legal advisors, environmental analysts, and former trade negotiators working under direct orders. Design a legal framework that makes water extraction without consent a punishable act, even for foreign entities protected by international agreements. The law was signed within 48 hours. It came into force as an emergency decree. The Water Sovereignty Act declared that all cross-border water extraction, transport, or sale must be publicly disclosed, registered with the National Oversight Commission, and subjected to regular audits. Any violation would trigger a full revocation of rights, a 5-fold penalty on extraction value, and immediate blacklisting from state operations. That meant even companies with legal contracts had to reapply. And here's what caught the attention of foreign investors. For the first time, Burkina Faso would use satellite surveillance and open-source intelligence to monitor unauthorized activity in real time, and would treat water breaches as violations of territorial sovereignty, not just trade infractions. It wasn't just bold, it was dangerous. Several international law firms called the act unenforceable. Trade envoys from the EU privately warned that sanctions were on the table. The IMF requested clarification on fiscal impacts, and the country's largest logistics partner suspended talks on a separate railway project. But on the ground, none of that mattered, because the response from the public was immediate. In the capital, students marched with signs that read, "Water is our flag." In rural provinces, communities started setting up local water councils, not because the government told them to, but because they didn't want to wait anymore. And if you think Americans wouldn't do the same, picture this. A foreign mining firm taps into the Colorado River without reporting. Arizona finds out 3 years later. Would it hold a press conference, or pass a law? Comment below. Would you back a law like this if it were your state? The backlash wasn't public, not at first. The first sign came in the form of a private memo sent to Burkina Faso's Economic Affairs Office. It came from a multinational trade council based in Brussels, warning that the new water regulations could be seen as a breach of existing investment protection agreements. 2 days later, 3 major foreign companies, one Australian, one French, one South African, suspended operations and began pulling out technical staff. No public statements. Just a line in their corporate dispatches. Environmental and regulatory instability. One of them had invested over $80 million in lithium extraction infrastructure. Another held mining rights to land overlapping with the same reservoir that had just been declared under national protection. And they weren't leaving quietly. Legal teams were activated in London and Geneva. Letters were sent. Demands for arbitration under the World Bank's ICSID framework were issued. Damages were cited. Losses calculated. Their position was clear. This was an unlawful nationalization of pre-existing agreements. Inside the presidency, the legal unit scrambled. International law is not written for countries like Burkina Faso. It favors investor protections, not resource sovereignty. The defense strategy? Make it political, not just legal. So the government began releasing maps, real-time water tracking data, aquifer stress levels, rainfall trends, climate models, showing that water levels in the shared basin had dropped by nearly 17% since the contract went into effect. They weren't just reclaiming what was stolen, they were stopping an ecological collapse. But the foreign press didn't pick it up. The global financial media framed the story differently. Risky anti-business shift in West Africa. Nationalist water law triggers investor exodus. The narrative was being shaped, and not in Burkina Faso's favor. Now, ask yourself this. If a U.S. state passed emergency water laws to stop a drought from worsening, would we call it anti-business? Or would we call it necessary? Let us know your take. If you think environmental sovereignty should outweigh corporate interests, say it, loudly, because silence was how this started. 3 days after the last company withdrew its field team, satellite feeds lit up across the northern border. Movement was detected around the primary pumping stations. Personnel count increased. New heat signatures suggested that at least 80 additional contractors had arrived on site, most of them carrying equipment not previously recorded. One image stood out: armored vehicles, light, mobile, equipped with communication towers, the kind used to defend, not evacuate. They weren't leaving, they were digging in. Traoré was briefed that same night. He didn't ask for speculation, he asked for numbers. How many men? Close to 900 across 5 compounds. Nationality? Unknown. No uniforms, no declared passports. Communications? Fully encrypted. New relay towers had been set up. Armament? Heavy enough to repel a frontal breach. Drones, jammers, night vision perimeter scans. The Defense Ministry's assessment was blunt. They're not preparing to negotiate. They're preparing to defend what they've built. The president didn't respond immediately. He stood at the edge of the room reviewing live satellite feeds projected onto the wall. Then he asked a question no one expected. How long would it take to breach the central control gate? The chief engineer answered without looking up. If we get close, less than 3 minutes. No one in the room spoke for several seconds. Then Traoré nodded once. Then we'll get close. Orders were issued the same hour. 3 special operations units were activated, a mix of hydro engineers, cyber technicians, and logistics troops. No official uniforms, no national insignia. They weren't being sent to attack, they were being sent to restore. No public announcement was made, but the streets knew. In markets, mosques, classrooms, and bus stations, word spread without being spoken. People weren't panicking, they were waiting. And if something like this happened near the US-Mexico border, if a foreign contractor fortified a water site, refused to leave, and blocked access to shared resources, would we hesitate to act? Would you? If not, hit like. Share this. Comment below. What's the line between investment and invasion? At 6:00 a.m., the president issued a direct radio address. No podium, no fanfare, just 4 minutes of language that made no promises, offered no apologies, and left no room for interpretation. They have taken what was not offered. They have ignored our laws, our restraint, our warnings. We are done waiting. The signal was broadcast nationwide. By the end of the hour, over 200 volunteers had assembled across the northern corridor, a mix of local guards, farmers, off-duty teachers, retired soldiers. No orders had been sent to them. They showed up anyway. Some carried plastic buckets, pots, some carried flags, most carried nothing but presents. Traoré boarded a military convoy that same afternoon. No press pool followed, just one satellite feed, one sealed case containing the override key, and a convoy of engineers behind him. As they approached the compound, the air went still. Razor wire shimmered under dry wind. On the other side, rows of armed men watched through visors, unmoving. They didn't lower their weapons, but they didn't raise them either. Traoré stepped out first. No helmet, just boots, dust on his sleeves, and the key in his right hand. At 20 meters, he stopped. Behind him, the line had formed, not of soldiers, but of citizens. Women with infants on their backs, elders leaning on canes, teenagers barefoot, hands empty. They came not to fight, but to surround. They linked arms. And suddenly, the question wasn't about infrastructure or treaties or profit margins. It was about whether anyone, contractor, CEO, or government, was willing to fire a bullet through a wall of unarmed civilians protecting their own water. Because here's the part most reports will never write. That day, the first people to reach the control station weren't Traoré's engineers. It was a grandmother from Tisala who stood in front of a drone camera and shouted, "This water is not yours." No one gave her that line. She just said it. Would you? The engineer reached the valve first. He didn't run. He just walked through the human wall, past the president, and knelt beside the metal housing. The biometric reader was dead, jammed, probably by design. He turned back, nodded once. "Manual?" Traoré nodded. The technician pulled a wrench from his vest. With every half turn, the sound grew, not mechanical, not violent, but pressure returning. A low hiss, steady, building. Then it came. A clear burst from the old pipeline outlet, no explosion, no roar, just water. Cold, clean, rising. Someone screamed. Another fell to their knees. A boy dipped his hands and shouted something no one understood, and it didn't matter. After 18 months of silence, the aquifer had spoken, and it didn't ask for permission. No bullet was fired, no one crossed a line, no body dropped, but a nation reclaimed its place, not with war, but with pressure and presence. In the hours that followed, footage spread fast. Traoré, standing ankle-deep in dust, watching water pour back into the land. No speech, no flag, just a hand on the shoulder of the same grandmother who had spoken to the drone. That image traveled farther than any broadcast. 3 days later, a statement appeared on the website of the Australian firm involved. They had suspended operations pending review. No apology, no admission, just retreat. 2 weeks later, a Sahel treaty was signed. 5 countries, a $2.4 billion sovereign water protection fund. New rules. No more extraction without joint approval, full transparency, environmental limits. 6 months after that, rice yields doubled in the eastern basin. School attendance jumped. Malaria cases dropped by a third. Water prices fell below pre-crisis levels. But the numbers weren't the point. The point was what no one could take back. And here's what stays. A small country, no nuclear arsenal, no leverage in global finance, rewrote the rules. Not with threats, not with deals, but by refusing to let thirst become policy. So ask yourself this. If they can do it without permission, without backing, what's stopping others? Would you wait for approval to survive? If not, say it below. Share this. Because water may be silent, but we don't have to be.